Ich habe jetzt die Ehre, durch das Programm des Eröffnungsplenums zu führen und darf auch gleich wieder ein paar Minuten aufholen. Deshalb mache ich das alles etwas kürzer und steige direkt ein. When introducing me, don't talk about my life, talk about why you invited me. This is what it says when you open up Dave deBronkart's website and look at his CV. And you try to find a few informations about how to introduce him. He doesn't want to be introduced, but he wants us to say why we invited him, and that's what I would like to do. We want to send a clear signal for patient orientation, patient engagement, and patient empowerment with this conference. And we know that you're a very inspiring speaker. Check out his TED Talk if you haven't. And we will also record this session so you can share it with your colleagues afterwards and spread the word for patient empowerment and patient engagement. We have heard that patients are the single most untapped resource in healthcare. And we're very excited to have you here, Dave, to enlighten us about the potential that lies within patients. And you have joined us from Boston, and a very warm welcome to you, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Am I on? Yes? Good. It's very good to be back in Berlin. Thank you so much for helping me, for inviting me. I honestly think, and I will make the case for you in the next few minutes, that we are at a turning point in the history of medicine. And I don't say that lightly. I myself have only a bachelor's degree. I don't have a doctorate. I talk about patient empowerment, but I am alive because of brilliant science and brilliant medical practice by people who have much more training and education and clinical experience than I do. So the question that faces us is, and this is why we come to conferences, is what is changing in the world that changes the field of possibilities in front of us, so that in the coming years, we can better achieve medicine's potential. And this is what I'll be speaking to you about. Patient engagement, participatory medicine, and today a very important part of it is personal health data. I worked in high-tech marketing, mostly in graphic arts and the printing industry in most of my life. I love data, I like automation, I like technical trends. In 2007, as you'll hear, I discovered I was almost dead with stage 4 kidney cancer, and I survived in less than a year. And according to my oncologist, part of how I did that was because I didn't just sit back and expect the health system to do everything for me. I got involved and did everything I could do to help. In 2008, I thought I really had thought about my funeral, but instead I was alive, so I started blogging, and I'll explain what this word e-patient means. In 2009, I was involved in the forming of the Society for Participatory Medicine. I wrote a blog post about garbage that I had found in my medical record, which was very surprising. I mean, these people had saved my life. How could they have garbage in the computer? And people started asking me to give speeches. I had learned how to give speeches when I worked in marketing, so that worked out well. And in 2010, I quit my day job and started doing this full time. In 2011, I did my TED Talk in Maastricht and started, this has become what I've done. Having not died, this is what I've done to try to give back to the medical profession. And in 2012, medical schools started inviting me. It was just crazy. Anyway, so now it's 650 events. Fundamental principle. All right, I am not a scientist. I don't work as a scientist, but I'm trained in scientific thinking. I'm an MIT graduate. I understand the scientific method. I understand that through the progress of science through the years, we come down to some fundamental principles which play out. Knowledge truly is power. And if there's a separate speech I give about what is empowerment, And it turns out there's a very good mechanism of action, a great body of knowledge in sociology. Hello? There we go. My doctor and I co-authored a book. Notice how he's letting me look at his computer. Right? People complain that their doctor is looking at the computer while they're back here. Well, he turns it. Sometimes he makes a mistake. He types the wrong thing into the computer, and I say, no, 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 and we fix it instead of having to go back and fix it later. This is another principle. We can perform better if we are informed better. It is a mistake to keep people away from knowledge and then say those people don't know anything. Right? Another fundamental principle, when assets digitize, things change fast. And as medical technology, as health data has become liquid, has become digital, things become possible that were not possible in the past. And the reason, again, coming to a conference, you need to learn to watch for these changes and don't be surprised. And then this is just beautiful, because when new things become possible, there's an opportunity to have a new kind of partnership, because patients have more at stake than anyone in how healthcare works out. So if we can find a way to listen to patients individually and as a community, we can create the best possible outcome. And another one of my principles is, from the very first health event I went to back in 2008, I noticed everyone was talking about patients as if they were the people out there on the street. Right? But I'm here to tell you, your time will come, if it hasn't hit you already, and all of a sudden it all looks different about how is this going to affect my mother, me, myself, my children. Innovation, all right? I believe this was, 1816. The development of the stethoscope, so that the physician no longer had to put it was always his ear on the patient's chest. Did you know, you probably do, it was not well received at first. The physician who wrote the preface to his book said that this will ever come into general use, I'm extremely doubtful. Right? Why? Because its hue and character is foreign and opposed. Basically, what this erudite doctor said was, this isn't the way we do things. So this is never going to get used. Now, importantly, in the second edition of the book, that was removed because they realized, this thing actually, it's not familiar to us, but it works pretty well. I've learned to think about the history of medicine because I'm a change activist, and I want to fit into a timeline. Most people know the name Oliver Wendell Holmes as the famous American Supreme Court Justice. This was his father, who was a physician, and he said in a speech to graduating medical students, this was 150 years ago from now, your patient has no more right to all the knowledge in your head than he has to all the medicine in your saddlebags. He should get as much as is good for him and no more. Now, importantly, some patient advocates point to this and say this is a horrible paternalistic attitude. That's not what he was thinking about, what he was talking about. Like everything on the internet, you have to dig beyond the headline. He knew that using his stethoscope, he would sometimes listen to a patient's chest and know that that patient was doomed. And what he was saying to the newly graduating doctors was, you have no right to ruin what's left of your patient's life. Because in 1871, there wasn't much doctors could do to save things. Now, fast forward 100 years, this physician was one of the mentors of my primary physician, Dr. Sands, who co-authored my book, and he's been saying since the 1970s, patients are the most underused resource in healthcare. And it raises the question, what's he talking about? Because we are not physicians, so that's what we'll be talking about here. This doctor, Tom Ferguson, I never met. He died a year before I came along, but you can see Dr. Sands right over his elbow in the center here. Since the 1980s, Dr. Ferguson, Doc Tom as he was known, was advocating for to empower patients by giving them information. He published a magazine and then a book called Medical Self-Care, and he knew that when trouble hits, a major limiting factor in what people can accomplish for their families was access to information. All right, and so that's why he published all this information for them to read. Now, when the web came along, he saw that this would completely change what was possible for patients to be active contributors to their care. And he started spotting all these people. The one on the left there is a Frenchman from Manhattan named Gilles Friedman. He started the first online patient community for his wife, who had his wife's disease, metastatic breast cancer, and all the others were pioneers in different ways. He coined the term e-patients, equipped, engaged, empowered, enabled. And when I learned about this in 2008, I changed my blogging name from Patient Dave to ePatient Dave. I had no idea it was going to become a famous thing. Again, notice that Dr. Sands turns the computer. This is a publicity photo, but it's realistic so that we can both see what's in there. And in 2009, that gang of crazy visionaries got together and decided to form the Society for Participatory Medicine. And you can believe my head was spinning as I was going through life, because those people looked around the room and said, you know what, this medical society cannot be run by only a doctor. It has to be a doctor and a patient partnership. And they all turned and looked at Dr. Sands and me and said, you are the chairman of the society. I'm like, okay, whatever. How do I do that? Well, here we are. In early January, actually at the end of December in 2006, I had a regular physical with Dr. Sands, and one thing I had was a complaint about a sore shoulder. And he sent me to get an x-ray, and I will never forget the phone call. If you've ever had a moment like this in your life, you may know what I mean, because I can vividly recall seeing the Sony desk phone on my desk at work with the digital clock 0:09:00. Precisely at 9 a.m., the phone rang, and it was Dr. Sands. He was saying, Dave, the radiologist called me, and I called up the image on my screen at home. Now, I was thinking, can I see it? Well, back then we couldn't. We didn't have screen sharing. There was a few people used Skype. Anyway, he said, Dave, your shoulder's going to be fine. It's just a rotator cuff problem, but there's something in your lung that shouldn't be there. He said, we don't know what it is. It could be a scar from some old infection, but we need to find out. So I came in and I got a CAT scan, and that showed that there were 5 of those in both lungs. Subsequent tests showed that it was kidney cancer. And this is a generic diagram of the disease from the drug I eventually got, high-dose interleukin-2. And notice, totally by coincidence, there's that thing that showed up in my x-ray. This figure has one in the left femur. I had a big bone metastasis in my left leg. It eventually broke. Pathological fracture. I have a patient safety tip for you. The way the leg broke was that I fainted from a reaction to an iodine dye. If you're going to have a pathological fracture, which is really painful, it's a good idea to pass out first. Because when I hit the floor, I was already gone. And by the time I woke up, shock had set in, so I had no pain. Anyway, I've always been an overachiever. That's how I got into MIT. So I have additional tumors everywhere. One in my ulna, instead of a brain metastasis, I had one in my cranium. And if you look at the head again, just before my treatment started, I developed a tumor in my tongue. I had kidney cancer growing out of my tongue muscle in my mouth. I was really sick. And the best available data, the oncologist correctly said there is not much data about people like you, people in my age group. But some people don't want to know. That's fine with me. But I have a huge appetite for information. And what I eventually did, what I eventually found, was that my median survival was 24 weeks. Now, it's still emotional to me to realize that feeling, you know. I sat there looking at this information, but I'll tell you what, that motivated me. It's like there is no time to lose. Some people will say, I've had enough, it's time for me to go. Not me. I was 57 years old, you know. Today I'm 72. I'm happy to be old. I know. But I remember thinking that night, lying in bed, what's the weather going to be the last time I look out a window? You know, what's my mother's face going to look like at my funeral? And the hardest thing was to sit down with my daughter, who had just gotten out of college, and say, this doesn't look good. She had her boyfriend with her, and I said, you know, we talked. She's a science teacher today. She's doing amazing. She's teaching DNA, she's teaching CRISPR and gene editing in the high school classroom. She's just incredible. Anyway, we said we're going to deal with this the best we can. And I don't want you guys to get married prematurely just so you can do it while Dad's still alive. And we got to work. An important moment happened when Dr. Sands connected me with Gilles Friedman, that Frenchman I mentioned, and I joined the network of patient communities. This has now become a company called smartpatients.com, not run by doctors, purely patients talking to each other about what's important to them. And, you know, the first thing they said was, welcome to the club that nobody wants to join, which was important, but, you know, because I'd never known anybody who had kidney cancer, and they saw things from my perspective. And most important, I knew that I was probably dying, but here I am talking to people who got the diagnosis 10 years ago, and they're not dead yet. You know, and this opened a space. When we talk about looking at healthcare from the patient's perspective, there is more to it than the biology. The biology is vitally important, but there is more to it. To make a long story short, surgery to remove the kidney, of course, and interleukin worked. The only surgery I got was, of course, to treat the broken leg and take out the kidney. But all the other tumors disappeared because the immunotherapy, high-dose interleukin, is incredible. It does detect all the tumors everywhere. 2 days after my first dose, that tumor fell off of my tongue. Everything over the tumors kept shrinking for 2 years after the treatment started. There's that one of those spots 6 months later. Now, most people, there's a real problem. The patient community said, and this was 15 years ago, there's no sure cure. There's no reliable treatment. There is this one thing that sometimes works. It usually doesn't. But when you respond at all, about half the time it's complete and permanent. And here I am. I was one of the lucky ones. But they said the side effects can be severe. They sometimes kill patients. And in fact, in my case, that's what happened. My treatment had to be discontinued 2/3 of the way through the protocol. I developed capillary leak syndrome. My legs blew up like water balloons. My blood pressure crashed to 50/30. But the patients had said, be sure you find a specialist hospital that does a lot of cases. And that's where we were. And within 20 minutes of that happening, they discontinued the treatment. And I survived. Several years into my advocacy, the BMJ, of all people, contacted me. I didn't go to them. They said, we think your story should be told. And I would not have been arrogant enough to tell them that, but they believed that the way patient advice helped save my life belonged in the literature. So I wrote this, but a little known fact about me is since next week is my 50th college reunion, which means 50 years ago, I was a hippie in Boston. And so I'm all for social revolution, social justice, and all of that. So I'm very interested in how does culture change. So it's great that the BMJ invited me to speak, but I knew doctors would read this. And so I asked my oncologist, what would you want other doctors to know about my case? Because he has an additional kind of credibility that I don't. And what he said was fascinating. He said, you were really sick, and I don't know if you could have tolerated enough of this medicine if you hadn't been so prepared. Now, this is a guy who does 100 cases a year of this, right, or more. What was he talking about? Well, so and here we get into what is empowerment. All right, here my only chance to survive is this medicine that usually doesn't work and sometimes it kills people. The disempowered person will say, I hope it works out okay for me. There's nothing I can do. That's powerlessness, right? There's nothing I can do to help. I thought, what could I do? So I asked the oncology team, how do I prepare for this treatment? And Dr. McDermott said, that's an interesting question. Nobody's ever asked us that. Right? And so, having asked the doctors first, I then turned to the patient community, and I got 16 stories from people who had been through this treatment. And so when every side effect hit, now remember here, there's a big difference between anecdotes and statistical significance. But in the absence of an excellent p-value, I'll take whatever I can get to help me survive. Well, I'm not kidding, all right? We need the literature, but when you are at the frontier of knowledge and you're out of options, it's legitimate to try things for which there is no evidence yet. So as it happens with every single thing that hit me, I had some idea what was happening. Now, here is the paradigm-busting question for you. We are all trained to think scientifically and to honor good p-values, but how can it be that relevant, useful, up-to-the-minute information could be someplace other than where we were trained to look? And the answer is that knowledge is empowering and access has changed forever. Because of the web, it is possible today in ways that were not possible 20 years ago for patients to connect to information and each other. Now, of course, as we've all seen in recent years, social media means there's also a disaster of toxicity out there. But how do we can't tell the world, hey, stop, let's go back 10, 20 years. We need to be moving forward and figuring out how to operate in the new world. I finally figured out that the way to explain this to doctors is that social media is information capillaries. And then they say, oh, I understand, there's a mechanism of action. Good, it's true, capillaries distribute nutrients without any centralized plan, And for those of you who are more methodical or scientific about information flow, I have a separate speech about this slide, right? In the old day, all knowledge traveled from the institution to the individual who knew nothing. And then Health 2.0 came along where it became read-write, and then Health 3.0. Mind you, this slide was first created in 2010. By the man who sponsored my TED Talk, a man named Lucian Englund, where it's all a network. Now, today we know this, right? But back then, this was a very unusual slide. And today we know that the mechanism of action is that these people who used to have no connections, now we do. And reality is a network of networks. And in information theory, it's the change from a closed system to an open network. Now, this leads into the newest things that are starting to happen. I want to point out, this is a slide I got from a friend at Microsoft more than 10 years ago. And it greatly aligns with one of the slides we saw in the opening with the patient in the center. Considering that information is empowering, look what's happening here now, because all of a sudden it is possible, not guaranteed, but possible for the consumer, the patient, to have information that the doctor does not. Right? And how does that alter? First, how does that alter how the doctor conducts healthcare, but also how does it alter how I run my life? I'll give you some new examples. First, though, this is my new concept. This is the book I'm hoping to finish this year. It's one of these books, I Need a Midwife. You know, I've been pregnant with this book for 4 years, and it just won't come out. But patients who extend science, they don't go to someplace like the NIH looking for a grant. They have their own problem. They do their own work. Dana Lewis is a type 1 diabetic. That's her pancreas on the desk. She and her friends in this so-called open APS, open artificial pancreas system, they have hacked into their digital insulin pump and digital glucose meter, and they wrote their own software to automatically dose themselves depending on their onboard carbs and everything. It took them several years. They designed it as the top priority for them was safety, because if you know anything about type 1 diabetes, you know that if it gets out of control, you can die distressingly fast. They've published papers now. If you just search that hashtag, you'll see a lot of it. This is crazy. How could they possibly be doing something without it coming through the industry? Well, you know what? Their big hashtag is, we are not waiting. They got tired of the industry saying another 5 years, another 5 years. So once they had access to the data because of the digital devices, they started writing their own software. It's not a product. They put it in open source so that anybody who wants to can download it. The patient who does that is responsible for their own modifications that they make to it, but the community helps. And look at this, ladies and gentlemen, this patient-developed software produces better glucose control than a working pancreas. They tweet pictures. This is typical overnight blood glucose screenshots. Here it is with APS. Unbelievable, and they did it themselves. Patients who extend science at the frontier of knowledge. They don't reject doctors. They haven't stopped going to their endocrinologist, but they are no longer limited by what the endocrinologist can offer. Here's another one. I'm going to be meeting this man next month. Watch his TED Talk. He has Marfan syndrome, which causes people to be tall and have long, spindly fingers. And it also causes aortic dissections. So they commonly will have surgery to replace their aortic root. And he thought, he said, well, you know, I work in a factory, and if we have a pipe that might burst, we don't start by cutting out that segment. We wrap it with something to try to strengthen it. So he exported the data from his MRI into a CAD-CAM system, which then 3D printed a bespoke, a custom fabric mesh that his surgeon wrapped around his aorta. And when he gives a speech, you know, he holds one in his hand, and he has, let's say, he has a strong opinion about, well, the medical establishment doesn't like him in many cases. He has been told, oh, you mean that wrap invented by that plumber? You don't want that. Lots of patients have died. Now, the surgeons who did it either are retired, they lost their license. Completely false. Not only that, but get this, nobody predicted this, but in a recent follow-up scan, they discovered that the fabric mesh has migrated into the wall of the aorta. So he now has a mesh-fortified aorta, which nobody imagined. Now, this does not mean if you or I sit at the kitchen table and think some things up, amazing miracles will happen, but it's possible. So somebody who says this is ridiculous is wrong, and that's not a good place for leading scientists to be. New things are possible. We have to figure out how to do it. And finally, I said at the beginning that, that your time will come. And indeed, a year and a half ago, I found out that due to a complication after my cataract surgery, I had developed glaucoma in my left eye. And this too, like the news that I was dying, really got my attention. I had suddenly gone, the Humphrey Visual Field test said I'd lost 30% of the vision in my left eye in about a period of about 2 weeks. It was a reaction to steroid drops. And I got involved. I learned as much as I could. And as you may know, glaucoma is managed by tracking the patient's eye pressure, and which you can only do in the doctor's office, and administering drops. Well, when I got connected with a patient community called fiteyes.com, I learned about this device. Ladies and gentlemen, this is my tonometer that lives in my pocket. It has a little probe. It doesn't do a puff of air, but just like this, I put it like this, and in 5 seconds, I get a reading of my eye pressure. And as a result, look at this. Instead of getting one reading every month or two when I'm in the doctor's office, I can do it several times a day and observe the diurnal variation. And using this, I determined to my great happiness that caffeine does not cause my eye pressure to shoot up. Yes, now that's a patient-oriented outcome, right? And it didn't cost the health. Wow. And it's data that my ophthalmologist welcomed. He said, good, go ahead and have as much coffee as you want. But now there are some spikes. Imagine if I had been in the doctor's office, right, for a reading at the moment. Let's see. Well, that big spike up there, it was just a momentary anomaly. But if that had been the moment when my pressure had been measured. Anyway, and I want to introduce to you also my friend Sarah in Stockholm. She has Parkinson's, and she developed this brilliant graphic, which has become her trademark. Each of those blue dots is 1 hour out of the year. And the red dot is the 1 hour, the 3 20-minute visits she has each year with her neurologist. And she and her neurologist have agreed that the focus of what they do during that red dot is to improve her ability to self-manage during all the blue dot hours. And in an astounding thing, last month, she was awarded a PhD in personal science as she applied rigorous scientific methods to her own self-tracking. This is bringing scientific rigor by an individual right into the conduct of care at the frontier. I am thrilled to be alive, and this is me on the night of, this is how it affects one guy's life. This is me on the night of that shoulder x-ray. This is a man who was dying and didn't know it yet. 10 months later, I was diagnosed in January. My treatment started in April and ended in July. I haven't had a drop of anything since. When immunotherapy works, it's amazing. At the office Halloween party in October, somebody snapped this picture, which I was very happy to see. I had pictured my mother's face at my funeral, but instead here we were 2 years later when I got to be with her on the day when I care about this. I got to see my daughter get married, and a few years later, I became a grandfather. And I'll tell you, during pandemic, when I got to be with that baby girl during school on Zoom, I was so happy she didn't have to say I never knew my grandfather because he died before I was born. That's how it was for me. I never knew my grandfathers. The work you do, especially coming to conferences to see what's out on the frontier at the leading edge of knowledge, is so, so, so important. I look forward to working with all of you and seeing how we can figure out how the heck do we modify how we were trained to practice in this new world where those people out there might have something they can contribute. Thank you so much.